There are places on this earth where the wind does not carry sound the way it should, where the silence is so complete, so absolute, that it begins to feel less like quiet and more like something deliberately imposed. Antarctica is one of those places, the southernmost continent, a frozen wilderness the size of a continent twice over, buried beneath kilometers of ancient ice, surrounded by oceans that punish the unprepared, and governed by international treaties that restrict access in ways unlike any other landmass on the planet. For most of human history, we told ourselves that Antarctica was simply empty, inhospitable, a place of geological curiosity and little else. But for decades, quietly and persistently, a different story has been forming, a story told in fragments, in classified briefings, in the hushed testimonies of retired military officers who chose their words carefully, in the experiences of scientists who returned from southern deployments changed in ways they struggled to articulate. A story that has circulated in the margins of official history, waiting for someone credible enough, tenacious enough, and brave enough to pull the threads together and hold them up to the light. That person is Moulton Howe. If you have spent any time researching the deeper questions of our world, questions that the mainstream has long refused to take seriously, you already know that name. If you are encountering her for the first time, then understand this. Moulton Howe is not a conspiracy theorist in the casual sense of that word. She is an Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker. She earned her Master of Arts degree in communication from Stanford University. She has spent more than 4 decades building a body of work that sits at the intersection of science, government secrecy, and phenomena that defy conventional explanation. Her reporting has been rigorous, her sources have been remarkable, and her willingness to follow a story wherever it leads, regardless of how uncomfortable the destination, has made her one of the most significant investigative voices of our time. For years, people close to her work knew that she had been gathering something specifically about Antarctica, something that sources within military and intelligence communities had been feeding her in pieces, carefully, almost as though they were testing how much the world was ready to hear. And then, after years of accumulation, after years of careful verification and cross-referencing, Moulton Howe began to speak. What she revealed was not a single event. It was not one discovery, one anomaly, one moment of strangeness that could be explained away. It was a layered, interconnected body of testimony, pointing toward a truth so significant that if it holds, it does not merely revise our understanding of Antarctica. It revises our understanding of everything. It begins, as so many of the deepest mysteries do, with ice. In the austral summer of 2016, something remarkable appeared in satellite imagery of the Antarctic continent. A series of geometric structures, partially visible beneath the surface of the glacial ice in the transantarctic mountain region, drew the attention of researchers operating outside official channels. The formations were not random. They were not the product of geological processes that any established model could cleanly account for. They were too regular, too deliberate. The angles were precise in ways that natural erosion and ice compression simply do not produce. Images began circulating. Scientists began arguing. And quietly, behind the public debate, something else was happening. Moulton Howe received a call. The caller identified himself as a retired Navy officer who had served multiple deployments in support of Operation Deep Freeze, the long-standing United States military logistics program that has operated in Antarctica since 1955. He had been thinking, he told her, about whether to speak for a long time. He had watched the satellite imagery debate unfold publicly and had decided that the moment had arrived. What he described in that initial conversation would become the foundation of one of the most extraordinary testimonies in the modern history of unexplained discovery. He told her that during one of his deployments, his unit had been redirected from its original mission assignment. No explanation was given at the time. Standard operational protocol? You go where you are ordered. You do not ask why. They were taken by aircraft to a region of the continent that he would only describe as being far inland, well beyond the areas where normal scientific operations were conducted. What they found there, emerging from the ice shelf in a section that had been subject to unusual thermal activity, was a structure, not a natural structure, not ice formations shaped by wind or pressure or the slow grinding mechanics of geological time, a structure that had been built. That bore the unmistakable signature of intentional construction. Walls that met at angles no natural process would create. Surfaces that, where they had been exposed by the thermal melt, appeared to be composed of a material none of the men in his unit could identify on sight. A dark, almost glassy substance that reflected light differently depending on the angle from which you viewed it. He told Linda Moulton Howe that the structure was large, far larger than what the exposed section suggested. Based on ground-penetrating radar assessments conducted by a separate team he was briefed on later, the full extent of what lay beneath the ice stretched for what he described only as an extraordinary distance. He would not give precise figures. He had been instructed, even in retirement, even in the context of a private conversation with a journalist, to be careful about specifics. But he said this. He said that standing at the edge of that exposed section, looking at walls that had been buried under ice for a period of time, that no human civilization as we know it could account for, was the most destabilizing experience of his life. Not because it was frightening in any immediate sense, but because in that moment, every assumption he had ever held about the timeline of human history, about what was possible, about what had existed before the world we know, simply ceased to hold. Linda Moulton Howe did not publish this testimony immediately. She is not that kind of journalist. She began to seek corroboration. What she found was not one confirming voice, it was many. A former contractor who had worked with a major defense logistics company supporting Antarctic scientific installations described being brought into a classified briefing during which he was shown photographs. He described the photographs as showing interior spaces, rooms, corridors, spaces that had clearly been designed and constructed with purpose. The walls in the photographs bore markings, not crude carvings, not random scratches, markings that had the organized visual density of a writing system, a language, something inscribed by intelligence on surfaces that had been sealed beneath Antarctic ice for a span of time that made the oldest known human civilizations look recent. He told her he was shown these images in the context of a program designed to assess whether the markings could be translated, whether patterns could be identified, whether meaning could be extracted. He did not know the outcome of that program. He was a logistical contractor. His role was operational support, not analysis. But the images, he said, never left him. He had seen them once, in a windowless room in a building he was never able to identify on a map, and they had defined the rest of his life. Then came the testimony that shifted the investigation into a different dimension entirely. A retired scientist who had worked for a government-affiliated research institution described being part of a team that had detected anomalous signals emanating from beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Not geological signals, not the kind of low-frequency acoustic activity associated with seismic movement or glacial calving. Something else, something that behaved with a periodicity, a regularity, a pattern that the team's signal analysts, initially convinced they were dealing with instrument error, eventually had to confront as real. The signals, as he described them to Linda Moulton Howe, had structure. They repeated at intervals that were not random, and they changed, not randomly, but in ways that responded or appeared to respond to changes in their measurement environment, as though whatever was generating them was aware of being measured, as though it was, in some incomprehensible way, communicating. The team's findings were classified within weeks of the initial analysis. The scientist was reassigned, The instruments were removed. He was told, in language that left no room for misinterpretation, that what he had measured did not exist. He was told to forget the work entirely. He was in his late 70s when he spoke to Linda Moulton Howe. He told her that he had spent the better part of 50 years trying to do exactly what he had been instructed to do, and that he had failed. That the memory of those signals, the visual representation of them on his readout screens, the way they shifted and altered and pulsed in their inscrutable rhythm, was as vivid to him as the day it had occurred. Now consider what this begins to suggest. Consider the shape of the picture that these testimonies, taken together, begin to form. Structures beneath the ice, structures of a scale and composition and deliberate geometry that no known chapter of human history can account for. Interior spaces, inscribed surfaces, a written language, signals emanating from depth, signals with structure and periodicity and apparent awareness, military operations redirected without explanation, classified briefings, photographs shown to contractors in unidentified buildings, scientists reassigned and silenced, decades of institutional effort to ensure that what was found in Antarctica remained unknown. The ice of Antarctica is old. In some regions, the ice sheet is estimated to be more than 27 million years old in its deepest layers. The continent itself was not always frozen. There is compelling geological evidence that Antarctica supported a very different climate in an earlier epoch. That liquid water existed there. That conditions once existed that were far more hospitable than anything we associate with the continent today. The question of what precisely existed during those earlier periods has never been fully answered by mainstream science, not because the question is unanswerable, but because the institutions that would need to fund and support the answer have shown a remarkable and consistent disinterest in pursuing it. Linda Moulton Howe has spoken about this pattern directly and without hesitation. She has noted that the volume of classified activity associated with Antarctica, activity that has intensified rather than diminished in recent decades, is not consistent with the official characterization of the continent as a region of purely scientific interest. She has documented the presence of military operations in Antarctica that exceed any logical requirement for supporting research stations. She has tracked the visits of world leaders, heads of state, senior religious figures, and corporate executives to Antarctica, visits that have been conducted with extraordinary secrecy and that have never been publicly explained. In 2016, a delegation including then United States Secretary of State John Kerry visited Antarctica during a period of significant international political tension. The visit was described publicly as an environmental awareness trip. No detailed account of what was seen or discussed has ever been provided. In that same year, Patriarch Kirill, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, visited Antarctica and was reported to have conducted prayers over the ice. The Russian military presence in Antarctica has expanded substantially in recent years, with new installations that go well beyond the requirements of scientific research. The overlap of geopolitical actors around a continent officially designated as a neutral scientific preserve is not coincidental. It is not random, and it has not been explained. Linda Moulton Howe has been told by sources she describes as highly credible and positioned within the deeper structures of intelligence and military operations that what has been found beneath the Antarctic ice is not simply old, it is not simply large, it is not simply mysterious in the conventional sense of a puzzle waiting to be solved by patient archaeological inquiry. What has been found, according to her sources, represents evidence of a civilization of non-human origin, a civilization that occupied the Antarctic continent during a period so remote from the present that no framework currently accepted by mainstream science can accommodate it, a civilization that was technologically advanced in ways that leave traces in the materials recovered from beneath the ice, traces that have confounded every analytical team that has examined them, She has described testimony from sources within the United States Navy who were present during operations in which objects recovered from beneath the Antarctic ice were transported off the continent under conditions of extreme security. Objects whose physical properties defied explanation. Objects that did not respond to temperature, pressure, or chemical analysis in ways consistent with any known material. Objects that, in at least one account relayed to her, appeared to be in some condition that the source could only describe as active, not inert. Archaeological artifacts from a dead civilization. Something that retained, in some manner not understood, a quality of function. Sit with that for a moment. Sit with the full weight of what that word implies. We have built our entire civilization on the assumption that we are the first. That the intelligence capable of building, of designing, of inscribing language, of constructing to a purpose, belongs to us and our ancestors alone. That the long arc of human history, stretching back perhaps 300,000 years if we are generous, represents the full story of what intelligence has achieved on this planet. Every museum, every textbook, every political philosophy, every religious tradition, every scientific framework rests on that foundation. What Linda Moulton Howe has spent years carefully documenting suggests that foundation may be incomplete, not wrong in every particular, not wrong about the existence of human history as we know it, but wrong in its assumption that human history is the whole story, that nothing came before, that the ice of Antarctica holds no memory older than the geological record we have allowed ourselves to examine. The implications are extraordinary. If structures of non-human origin exist beneath the Antarctic ice, then the question of who built them leads immediately to deeper questions. Questions about the nature of intelligence in the universe, questions about the history of this planet before the period we have always called ancient, questions about what agreements, what arrangements, what processes of containment and control have been built around these discoveries by the governments and institutions that have known about them. Questions about why the people of this world have been kept at a distance from a truth of this magnitude for this long. Linda Moulton Howe has not claimed to have all the answers. She is a journalist. Her work is to gather, to verify, to present, and to refuse to look away. She has said that her sources, many of them elderly, many of them speaking at the end of lives defined by the weight of what they carried, came to her because they believed the truth deserved to exist outside of classified vaults, because they believed that the civilization now living on the surface of this planet had a right to know what lay beneath the ice of its southernmost landmass, because silence at the end of a life spent keeping it begins to feel less like duty and more like theft. Antarctica continues to exist as it always has, remote, frozen, governed by treaties that will be renewed again as they always are, with their restrictions intact and their exceptions unexamined. Expeditions continue to depart. Some return with data that is published, some return with data that disappears into classification systems so deep that no Freedom of Information request will ever surface it. The ice does not speak. But people do. And the people who have spoken to Linda Moulton Howe, the Navy officers and defense contractors and retired scientists and intelligence community insiders who chose, at the end of long lives defined by secrecy, to place what they knew in the hands of someone who would not let it disappear, those people have begun to form something that feels less like rumor and more like record. We do not yet know the full shape of what lies beneath the southern ice. We do not yet have the photographs, the physical samples, the open scientific examinations that would allow the world to confront this evidence directly. We may not have those things in our lifetimes. The machinery of institutional secrecy is patient and well-resourced and deeply practiced at the art of indefinite delay. But consider this. Every great secret in human history was, at some point, protected by people who believed it would never come to light. Every truth that was eventually known was, before it was known, dismissed as impossible. Every discovery that remade the world began as something someone in power tried to contain. The ice is melting, slowly, relentlessly, indifferently. The thermal changes reshaping the Antarctic continent are not waiting for political decisions or classification reviews or the careful management of narrative. The Earth itself is, in its own geological time, beginning to undo what millennia of ice have concealed. What will be there when it is fully uncovered? What will we do with it when we can no longer pretend we have not seen it? And what does it mean for every story we have ever told ourselves about who we are and where we come from, if what Linda Moulton Howe has spent her career documenting turns out to be exactly what her sources told her it was? The silence of Antarctica is not empty. It never was. And those who know what it holds have run out of excuses for keeping the rest of us from hearing it.